Have you ever been judged not for your character, not for your actions, but simply for how you looked? Imagine walking onto a first-class flight, holding your ticket like everyone else, only to be treated as if you don't belong. That's exactly what happened to Naomi Ellis, a successful CEO dressed in nothing more than a simple sweater and worn sneakers. A flight attendant looked at her once and decided she wasn't worthy of respect. But here's the question when someone underestimates you. Do you stay silent, or do you stand firm in your dignity? What if it were you tired, traveling, just wanting peace, only to be humiliated in front of strangers? Would you shrink back, or would you hold your seat? Naomi's story doesn't stop with insult, because the truth waiting outside the airport, a husband in a Rolls Royce, and a woman's unshakable calm would flip the power dynamic entirely, setting off a chain of events no one expected. Stay with me. This isn't just about flying first class. It's about dignity, justice, and the quiet strength we all carry. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the story you're about to hear might just change the way you see yourself. Naomi Ellis moved quietly through the security line at Boston Logan International Airport, the straps of her worn leather tote digging into her shoulder. She had flown countless times before, but this morning felt heavier than most. She wore a simple gray sweater, a pair of jeans that had clearly seen better days, and sneakers that were comfortable rather than stylish. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, strands falling over her face as she adjusted her boarding pass in her hand. If anyone passing by had looked closely, they might have noticed the small, elegant wedding band on her finger, or the steady way she carried herself, her shoulders straight, her eyes calm. But most people didn't notice. They only saw the sweater with the faint pilling near the sleeves, the scuffed shoes, the tote that had traveled across states more times than she could count. Naomi didn't mind. She had long ago learned that appearances never told the whole story. Still, every now and then, she felt the sting of being judged before she even opened her mouth. Her flight was headed to Miami, a short business trip before the weekend. She had booked a first-class ticket, not for luxury, but for the quiet it offered. A few hours of peace where she could close her eyes, prepare her notes, and breathe. The first-class boarding lane was almost empty when she walked up. A young couple stood ahead of her, chatting and laughing, their matching designer luggage gleaming under the airport lights. Behind her, an older man in a pressed suit checked his watch impatiently. Naomi felt the eyes of the gate agent slide briefly over her outfit, then back to the screen. No words, just a glance that lingered a second too long. She presented her boarding pass, smiled softly, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the hum of the engines was a familiar comfort. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. Naomi found her seat 2B near the window. She slid into it with a sigh of relief, placing her tote beneath the seat in front of her. It was a small thing, but to her, it mattered having a space to herself, even if just for a few hours. She imagined the quiet, the steady rhythm of the plane carrying her south, away from Boston's chill. Passengers filed in slowly, some in tailored blazers, some in polished heels. They passed Naomi without a second glance, but she could feel the air shift around her, as though she were an unexpected detail in a well-rehearsed scene. She rested her hands in her lap, straightened her sweater, and let her gaze fall to the window. Outside, ground crew hurried across the tarmac, neon vests flashing against the gray morning sky. For a moment, she allowed herself to drift, to remember the weekend she and Leonard, her husband, had promised each other no work, no deadlines, just us. Miami would be the start of that. The thought made her smile. Leonard had insisted on driving her to the airport that morning, but a last-minute call had held him back. She remembered his words as he kissed her forehead in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee still hanging in the air. "Naomi, just relax. I'll see you in Miami. Don't let anyone ruin your peace." She had promised him she wouldn't. At least, she had hoped she wouldn't. A flight attendant passed by, nodding briskly to passengers as they settled in. He glanced at Naomi briefly, then moved on. Nothing unusual, just routine. Naomi took a deep breath, folded her hands, and thought of the hours ahead. She wanted nothing more than to sink into quiet anonymity, to be just another traveler in the sky. What she didn't know, what none of the passengers around her knew, was that the flight ahead would be anything but ordinary, and that her choice of sweater and sneakers would soon become the spark for a moment none of them would ever forget. Naomi had just opened her notebook, ready to review a few bullet points she had scribbled the night before, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up to see a man in a pressed navy uniform standing stiffly in the aisle. His name tag read Mark Duffy. He leaned slightly toward her, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of boarding. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat," he said, his eyes flicking from her sweater to her sneakers, then back to her face. Naomi blinked, keeping her tone steady. "No, this is my seat. 2B. She angled her boarding pass so he could see clearly. Mark didn't look at the ticket right away. He stared at her for another beat, lips pressed in a thin line, before finally glancing down at the pass. His brow furrowed, then smoothed, though his voice carried a hint of disbelief. "This is a first-class seat," he said, as if she didn't already know. "I'm aware," Naomi answered softly. "That's why I boarded through the first-class lane." A couple across the aisle turned their heads. Naomi felt the weight of their eyes, curious, cautious, almost expectant. Mark drew in a breath, his smile tight. "Sometimes mistakes happen. You might want to double-check your boarding pass again." She slid the paper closer to him. "It says 2B. His eyes skimmed the ticket again, then darted back to her outfit. "Right. Well, let me confirm with the system," he muttered, tapping something into his tablet. The gesture wasn't necessary. He had already seen the truth, but Naomi recognized the dance. It was the kind of hesitation that said more about him than about her. Passengers filed past them, slowing as they noticed the small scene unfolding. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to witness. Others lingered with subtle interest, the way people do when they sense conflict but don't want to be caught staring. Mark cleared his throat. "I see the reservation here," he finally admitted, but he let the word hang in the air, then leaned closer. "Ma'am, are you sure you can afford this section?" The sentence landed like a slap. Naomi's jaw tightened, though she kept her gaze level. "I purchased the ticket myself," she said quietly. Her calmness seemed to unsettle him. He straightened, crossing his arms. "We've had issues with fraudulent upgrades before. It causes problems for the airline. I just want to make sure everything is appropriate." Naomi's voice remained steady. "There's nothing fraudulent here. I belong in this seat." But the exchange was no longer private. The businessman in 2A shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his cufflinks. The young couple from the gate whispered behind their hands, stealing glances at Naomi's sweater, then at each other. Mark gave a thin laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. "I think it'll be best if you sit in the main cabin until we clear this up." It wasn't phrased as a question. It was phrased as an instruction. Naomi's pulse quickened, For a brief second, she thought of Leonard's words that morning, "Don't let anyone ruin your peace." She inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, then gathered her tote bag from beneath the seat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply rose and walked down the aisle, following Mark's gesture toward the rear of the plane. The shuffle of her sneakers against the carpet felt louder than it should have. Eyes followed her down the narrow walkway. Not one passenger spoke. Not one offered their voice. Silence filled the cabin like a second layer of air, heavy and undeniable. At row 18, Mark pointed stiffly to an empty window seat. "You can sit here until the matter is resolved." Naomi slid into the seat without a word. Her tote landed softly against her legs. The man beside her glanced at her once, quickly, then fixed his gaze on his phone. His fingers scrolled furiously, though the screen hadn't changed. Naomi leaned her head against the cool window, closing her eyes. Inside, her thoughts churned. She had faced worse humiliations before a professor who once accused her of plagiarism because her essay was too well written, a client who asked to speak to someone higher up even though she was the one in charge. She knew this terrain, the ache of being reduced to an assumption, but still, this one cut deep. Not because of the seat, not even because of Mark's words, but because of the silence. All those witnesses, all those eyes, and not a single person said. She showed him her ticket. Not a single voice said, "Let her stay." Her phone buzzed faintly in her hand. Leonard's name lit up the screen. She typed quickly, fingers steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest. "Seated in economy, flight attendant moved me. No reason other than how I look." 3 dots appeared, vanished, reappeared. Then Leonard's reply, "I'll meet you in Miami. Don't let this break you. We'll handle it together." Naomi slipped the phone back into her tote and pressed her palm against her knee, grounding herself. She would not cry. She would not give Mark or anyone else that satisfaction. Above her, the overhead bins clicked shut. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, calm and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Please fasten your seatbelts." As the plane taxied down the runway, Naomi's reflection stared back at her from the window. Strong, steady, silent for now. The seat in row 18 was narrow, the fabric worn smooth from years of use. Naomi sat still, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Around her, passengers adjusted overhead vents, tugged at seat belts, and unfolded magazines. To anyone looking, she appeared calm, a woman resigned to an inconvenience. Inside, however, her thoughts moved like a tide, steady but unrelenting. She could still hear Mark Duffy's voice, sharp and dismissive. "Are you sure you can afford this section?" Words designed to bruise, to remind her of invisible lines that others believed she should not cross. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the engine's low rumble fill her ears. 1,000 memories pressed against her boardroom tables where she had been mistaken for an assistant, networking events where introductions skipped over her as if she were invisible, clients who assumed she was there to take notes rather than to lead. Each moment etched into her like faint scars. But there was another memory, too, her grandmother's voice, steady as the rocking chair on the porch in Georgia where Naomi spent summers as a child. "Baby, you don't have to fight every battle the moment it starts. Some fights are won by knowing when to wait and when to strike." Naomi breathed in slowly, let it out, and pressed her hand against her knee. Waiting didn't mean surrender. Silence could be a form of strength, a choice to conserve energy for the moment it mattered most. Beside her, a young woman slipped into the aisle seat, clutching a paperback novel. She glanced at Naomi, then quickly looked away, as though embarrassed to have witnessed the earlier scene. After a few moments, the woman leaned slightly closer and whispered, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Naomi opened her eyes, studied her. The woman's dark hair fell across her face. Her hands trembled slightly against the book. "What's your name?" Naomi asked softly. "Julia," she said. "Julia Nguyen. I didn't know what to say back there." Naomi gave a faint smile. Most people don't. Julia's cheeks flushed. "I should have said something. He was wrong." Naomi tilted her head, voice gentle but firm. "It's not about guilt. It's about choice. Maybe next time you'll use your voice. That's how change happens, one voice at a time." Julia nodded, her eyes brimming with quiet conviction. Then she opened her book, though Naomi noticed she didn't turn a single page for the next half hour. The plane climbed higher, clouds drifting past the windows in slow, endless waves. A cart rattled down the aisle. Mark passed by without glancing at Naomi, his attention fixed on the rows ahead, his back straight, his jaw tight, as if he had already dismissed her from his mind. Naomi watched him move, and she wondered not for the first time how many others he had treated the same way. How many people had been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. Her phone buzzed again. She shielded it discreetly from view. Opening Leonard's new message. "Landed business early. I'll meet you right outside. Hold steady. I'm proud of you." The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. Leonard's presence, even through words, steadied her heartbeat. She typed back quickly, "I'm fine. Just observing. Sometimes silence teaches louder than words." As the hours stretched on, Naomi let herself slip into reflection. She remembered her first corporate job, where a supervisor once handed her his coat as she walked into a meeting, mistaking her for staff. She had returned it with a quiet, "I don't carry coats. I carry solutions." That day, the room had laughed, but months later, the same supervisor introduced her as the smartest strategist we've got. It had been the same lesson, repeated again and again. Dignity was not given. It was asserted, quietly but firmly, until the world had no choice but to see it. Now, as the clouds parted and the light of midday spilled across the cabin, Naomi made a decision. She would not allow this flight to end with humiliation lingering in the air. No, this would be the seed of something larger. The captain's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We're cruising at 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Naomi leaned against the window. Below, the Atlantic stretched wide and endless, sunlight dancing across its surface. She felt a calm resolve settle inside her. This wasn't the moment to raise her voice. The real moment was coming. And when it did, she would be ready. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane settled into its long stretch above the clouds. Naomi sat with her head turned toward the oval window, watching thin streaks of white blur against the endless blue. To anyone else, she looked like a traveler lost in thought, passing time with silence. But inside, her mind was alive, pulling at threads of memory that wove together into something heavier than the flight itself. She remembered her college years, a lecture hall with rows of seats that creaked whenever someone shifted. She had turned in a research paper on international trade. Weeks of effort poured into every sentence. When the professor returned the papers, hers had a red note scrawled across the top. Too advanced for a freshman, likely plagiarized. Naomi had sat frozen in her chair, the humiliation burning in her chest. She confronted the professor afterward, her voice shaking as she explained her sources, her process, the long nights in the library. He had only raised an eyebrow, skeptical. It wasn't until a teaching assistant confirmed her citations line by line that he begrudgingly changed her grade. That day taught her something she would never forget. Excellence alone wasn't always enough. Sometimes, people saw what they wanted to see, and if you didn't fit their picture, they questioned your right to be there. She carried that lesson with her into her first job. Fresh out of graduate school, she had joined a consulting firm, eager and ready. But during her first client meeting, a senior partner had handed her his jacket without a word. Assuming she was there to collect coats, Naomi had felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she steadied herself, placing the jacket gently on the back of his chair. Then she sat down, opened her folder, and began presenting the strategy she had prepared. By the time she finished, the room was silent, the weight of her authority undeniable. That same partner later introduced her to colleagues as the sharpest mind in the firm. But the sting of that first impression never quite faded. Now, on this flight to Miami, Naomi felt those same echoes in Mark Duffy's eyes. The disbelief, the condescension, the unspoken assumption, "You don't belong here." She touched the edge of her sweater absent-mindedly. The fabric was soft from years of wear, a favorite piece she often packed for flights. To her, it was comfort. To Mark, it had been evidence. Her thoughts shifted to Leonard. How many times had he reminded her, in his calm baritone, that her worth wasn't up for debate? He had been there the night she almost quit her firm, worn down by endless microaggressions. She remembered sitting at their kitchen table, head in her hands, whispering, "Maybe I don't have the energy to keep proving myself." Leonard had leaned across the table, taking her hand. "Naomi, the fact that you have to prove yourself twice as hard doesn't mean you don't belong. It means you're stronger than anyone who doubts you." That strength, that quiet conviction, was what carried her now. The hum of the engine lulled the cabin, passengers dozing with headphones on, flight attendants pulling curtains closed at the front. Naomi reached into her tote and pulled out a slim leather-bound notebook. She opened it to a page filled with neat handwriting, a mix of tasks and reflections. At the top, a phrase she often wrote to herself: "Choose your moment." She tapped the pen against the margin, staring at the words. Mark expected her to vanish into the background, to accept the seat in economy and let the story end there. But Naomi knew better. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Her phone buzzed once more. A short message from Leonard Driver Ready. "Call me when you land." She smiled faintly. He always thought ahead, always prepared the ground. Naomi slipped the phone back into her bag and leaned her head once more against the window. The sun had shifted, casting a golden glow over the wing outside. For a moment, it looked like fire trailing across metal, blazing silently against the sky. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of her breath. Inside her chest, the anger had softened into something steadier resolve. She would not lash out mid-air, not argue in cramped rows where witnesses would only remember her voice raised, not his words cutting. She would wait until the ground, until the moment she could stand tall with Leonard by her side and remind them all what dignity looked like when it refused to bow. In that quiet, Naomi whispered a sentence only she could hear. "I don't need to shout to be heard." The engines roared, the sky stretched wide, and Naomi sat in silence, carrying her grandmother's wisdom, Leonard's faith, and her own unshakable truth. The cabin had settled into the rhythm of flight pages turning, laptops opening, the occasional chime of a seatbelt sign. But beneath the quiet hum, Naomi felt something else moving through the air. It wasn't just her imagination. The tension was real, a thread pulled taut between rows, stretching and straining, ready to snap. Mark Duffy moved briskly up and down the aisle, his posture rigid, his tone clipped. He stopped to ask a man in row 12 to stow his backpack more securely, then lingered longer than necessary, repeating the request as if the first response hadn't been good enough. The man complied, his expression blank, but Naomi caught the faint flicker of irritation on his face. She noticed how Mark's demeanor shifted depending on who he addressed. The woman in a tailored suit received a smile, his voice smooth and obliging. A young mother traveling alone with her child, however, was met with a sigh and a muttered warning about keeping the aisle clear. Naomi had seen this pattern before in offices, in restaurants, even in her own building lobby. People who wielded small power like a weapon, deciding moment by moment who deserved courtesy and who did not. Julia Nguyen, seated beside her, lowered her book and whispered, "He's doing it again. It's not just you." Naomi glanced at her, her voice calm. Patterns tell the truth better than words. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I feel guilty. I didn't speak up earlier." Naomi studied her face earnest, conflicted. She could almost hear the young teacher's inner battle, or the tug between fear and conscience. "Guilt doesn't change the past," Naomi said gently, "but awareness can change the next choice." Julia swallowed, her eyes fixed on the aisle. Naomi saw the flicker of resolve there, faint but growing. A sudden jolt shook the cabin as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Gas rippled through the rows, hands gripping armrests. Mark's voice rose above the unease, firm but almost scolding. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated. Fasten your seatbelts. There's no need for panic." The tone did little to soothe. Passengers shifted nervously, and Naomi felt Julia's hand tighten briefly around the edge of her seat. Naomi remained still, breathing evenly. She had weathered worse storms, both in the air and in life. The turbulence eased after a few minutes, leaving behind a nervous silence. Naomi looked around, noting the wary glances people exchanged. She wondered if any of them recognized how authority was being exercised in front of them, not for safety, but for dominance. Mark reappeared with the beverage cart, his smile returning as he leaned toward a man in first class. The laugh he gave was exaggerated, rehearsed. When he reached economy, the smile vanished. His tone cooled. He asked questions without looking directly at passengers, as though service here was an obligation rather than part of his role. When he reached Naomi's row, his eyes flicked toward her briefly, then shifted to Julia. "Something to drink?" he asked curtly. "Water, please," Julia said softly. He poured the cup quickly, setting it down with a dull thud. Naomi watched him, waited a beat, then spoke evenly. "I'll take water as well." His gaze landed on her, held for a fraction too long, then slid away. "Fine." The word clipped, almost bitten off. He poured the water, placed it on her tray with a sharp clink, and moved on. Julia looked at Naomi, her face pale. Naomi only raised her cup slightly, as though in a quiet toast. "Even silence speaks," she murmured. The teacher's lips curved in a faint smile. She nodded, understanding more than Naomi said aloud. As the flight wore on, Naomi sensed the weight of unspoken tension settling deeper into the cabin. Passengers shifted uneasily, exchanging glances they didn't voice. Some had noticed what was happening. Most chose not to. But Naomi knew the silence itself was part of the story. She leaned back in her seat, letting the low drone of the engine steady her. Every encounter, every slight, was another stone added to the scale. And when the moment came to tip it, the weight would be undeniable. Her phone vibrated once more. She slipped it from her tote discreetly. Leonard again. "On schedule, I'll be waiting." She typed back, "Yes, quiet for now." Watching, her reflection in the window caught her eye. Calm, steady, eyes sharp. A woman who had spent years carrying dignity like armor, who knew when to wait and when to act. The cart rattled away, Mark's footsteps fading down the aisle. Naomi sipped her water, her voice low enough that only Julia could hear. "Respect shouldn't be conditional," she said. Julia's reply was almost a whisper. "Maybe one day people will understand that." Naomi turned her gaze back to the clouds drifting past. She didn't answer, but in her silence, the promise was there, clear, unwavering. The day was coming. The landing gear thudded beneath the cabin, jolting Naomi gently in her seat. Passengers stirred awake, stretching arms and rubbing eyes as the announcement came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Miami International Airport. The local time is 3:05 p.m. Naomi closed her notebook and slipped it back into her tote. The hum of the engine slowed, and with it came the subtle tension of people ready to disembark, zippers opening, belts snapping free, the shuffle of bags pulled from overhead bins. Julia glanced at her. "You okay?" Naomi offered a calm smile. "I'm fine." The plane rolled to the gate, brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The chime signaled permission to stand, and passengers surged into the aisle. Mark Duffy appeared again, his smile returning as he helped a suited man with his carry-on. He was gracious with some, impatient with others. When Naomi stood, her tote slung over her shoulder, Mark stepped into the aisle, blocking her for a second too long. His voice was low, meant only for her. "Remember, economy rows disembark after first class." Naomi held his gaze evenly. "I'll wait my turn." Her voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. He smirked faintly, then moved on, ushering first-class passengers forward. Naomi walked steadily down the aisle, Julia close behind. A few passengers cast furtive glances, recognition flickering in their eyes, but no one spoke. The jet bridge air was heavy, humid, a sharp contrast to the chilled cabin. Naomi walked with measured steps, her tote snug against her side. Julia gave her a quiet nod of farewell. "Good luck," she whispered before slipping into the crowd. Naomi made her way toward the arrivals hall. The noise grew louder, voices mingling, luggage wheels clattering, announcements echoing from overhead speakers. Then, through the glass doors, she saw him. Leonard Ellis stood tall near the curb, his broad shoulders relaxed in a tailored charcoal suit. His presence radiated calm authority, the kind that drew eyes without effort. Behind him, a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom gleamed under the Miami sun, its polished surface reflecting the chaos of the pickup lanes. A driver in uniform stood by, holding the rear door open. Naomi stepped outside, the warm air wrapping around her. Leonard's eyes found hers instantly, and the faintest smile touched his lips. He moved forward, embracing her with quiet steadiness. "Rough flight?" he asked softly. She leaned into the hug for a moment before pulling back. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Mark had followed passengers onto the curb, his voice raised as he directed a family toward baggage claim. He turned, and his eyes froze on the scene before him. Naomi standing beside Leonard, the Rolls-Royce waiting with quiet grandeur. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, His steps faltered. Naomi felt the moment stretch, the recognition dawning in his expression. He had assumed, dismissed, diminished, and now the truth stood before him, undeniable. Leonard extended his hand, helping Naomi into the back seat. She slid gracefully inside, setting her tote on the leather cushion. The driver closed the door with a soft click. Through the tinted glass, Naomi saw Mark still standing frozen on the sidewalk. His professional mask cracked, eyes wide with disbelief. Passengers around him whispered, their gazes shifting from him to the car and back again. Leonard climbed in beside her, the faint scent of his cologne grounding her. He reached for her hand. "You don't have to explain. I can see it in your eyes." Naomi exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the day leave her shoulders. "He made sure I knew I didn't belong." Leonard squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll make sure he knows exactly who you are. And more importantly, we'll make sure it doesn't happen to the next person." The Rolls-Royce pulled smoothly into traffic, the city rushing past. Naomi leaned back against the seat, her gaze steady. She wasn't thinking about Mark's face anymore, or the whispers of the crowd. She was thinking ahead to the meetings she would request, the conversations that would follow, the change she would insist upon. The humiliation on the plane had been real, but this moment, this quiet reveal of truth, was only the first ripple. The real storm had yet to come. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly through Miami streets, the city's vibrant colors flashing past the windows. Naomi sat quietly, her hand still resting in Leonard's. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Leonard broke the silence. "We can let this go. Naomi, just enjoy the weekend. No one would blame you." Her gaze stayed on the skyline. "If I let it go, then it's not just me who's diminished. It's every woman who looks like me, every passenger who gets judged before a word leaves their lips." That silence cost too much. Leonard studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He knew better than to argue when her voice carried that quiet resolve. By the time the car pulled up to their hotel, a glass tower shimmering against the late afternoon sun, Naomi's mind had already begun arranging the pieces. She could see the path unfolding, the witnesses, the evidence, the call that needed to be made. The next morning, Naomi requested a meeting with Helen Brooks, the airline service executive for the Miami hub. Helen was a woman in her early 50s, known for her no-nonsense style and her ability to handle difficult situations with precision. She agreed to meet at the hotel's private conference lounge. Helen arrived promptly, her navy suit pressed, her badge clipped neatly to her lapel. She shook hands with Naomi and Leonard, her expression professional but wary. "Mrs. Ellis," she began, her tone formal. "I understand you had some concerns during your flight yesterday." Naomi folded her hands on the table, her voice calm but steady. "Concerns is one way to describe it. What I experienced was more than poor service. It was targeted disrespect, based on nothing more than how I was dressed." Helen adjusted her glasses, taking notes on a tablet. "Could you walk me through what happened?" Naomi did, step by step. She recounted the dismissive looks, the curt tone, the deliberate delays. She described how Mark Duffy's behavior shifted depending on who he served. She mentioned Julia Nguyen, the passenger who witnessed and quietly confirmed the pattern. Leonard remained silent, his presence steady, but Naomi could feel his quiet support at her side. Helen listened carefully, nodding at intervals. When Naomi finished, she leaned back slightly. "I appreciate you bringing this to me directly. We take allegations like this seriously." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't just about me. I don't need an apology. What I need is assurance that systemic disrespect won't continue unchecked, that your airline won't quietly shuffle papers and hope the story fades. Helen exhaled slowly. I hear you. I'll open a formal investigation. That means reviewing crew conduct, interviewing passengers, and checking internal records. But these processes take time. Naomi shook her head. Time isn't the issue. Transparency is. If this remains hidden, nothing changes. If it comes into the light, accountability follows. Helen hesitated, then asked carefully, Are you intending to take this public? Naomi let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. That depends on how your company responds. I'd prefer not to, but I won't allow silence to protect misconduct. Helen nodded again, her expression softening just slightly. I respect that. Give me 48 hours to gather information. I'll contact you directly. After she left, Leonard turned to Naomi. She seemed receptive. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Receptive doesn't equal action. We'll see what she does when the truth starts to scrape against reputation. 2 days later, Helen called, Mrs. Ellis? I'd like you to come to our office. There are findings I think you should hear firsthand. The Miami headquarters was sleek and modern, glass walls reflecting the city beyond. Helen greeted them in the lobby, her face composed but serious. In a private room, she pulled up a set of reports on a large screen. We reviewed crew logs, passenger feedback, and internal communications. Several points stood out. There were discrepancies between Mr. Duffy's written account and the testimonies of multiple passengers. Naomi leaned forward slightly. So he falsified his report. Helen paused. It appears he downplayed key interactions. He noted that some passengers were difficult, but the language used suggests a pattern of bias. The discrepancy is significant. Leonard crossed his arms. And what will be done? Helen looked directly at Naomi. We're considering disciplinary action. But I want to be clear. Termination is serious, and we have to ensure due process. Naomi's voice remained calm, though her eyes were sharp. Discipline without transparency is just another way of hiding. If this is handled quietly, the lesson is lost. If it's addressed openly, change becomes possible. Helen hesitated, then asked, What outcome would satisfy you? Mrs. Ellis. Naomi let the question settle before answering. Satisfaction isn't the goal. Integrity is. The outcome I want is for your airline to stand behind the values it claims to uphold. That means accountability, training that actually matters, and a message to every employee that dignity is non-negotiable. For the first time, Helen's expression softened with something like respect. I'll bring this to the CEO myself. I can't promise his response, but I can ensure your voice is heard at the highest level. As they left the building, Leonard looked at Naomi with quiet admiration. You didn't raise your voice once, but the weight of your words filled the room. Naomi slipped her sunglasses on, her reflection glinting in the lenses. Noise fades, steadiness lasts, and when steadiness carries truth, it leaves no room for denial. The Miami sun poured through the tall glass windows of the airline's headquarters, but inside the conference room, the air felt heavy, deliberate. Naomi sat across from Helen Brooks again, Leonard steady at her side. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, the kind of neutral atmosphere designed to soften difficult conversations. Helen cleared her throat. Mrs. Ellis, we've opened a formal investigation. Mr. Duffy has been placed on administrative leave pending review. We've also contacted passengers who might corroborate details of the incident. Some have already responded. Naomi folded her hands on the table, her posture composed. "And what have they said?" Helen tapped her screen. Several passengers mentioned noticing inconsistent treatment. One woman described his tone toward you as abrasive and unnecessary. Another noted he seemed polite and attentive with others while dismissive toward you. These accounts align with your statement. Naomi remained quiet, her eyes steady on Helen. Silence, she knew, often said more than words. Helen shifted in her seat. "We also reviewed footage from the jet bridge camera. While it doesn't capture audio, it shows Mr. Duffy blocking your path briefly during deplaning. His report omitted that interaction." Leonard leaned forward. "So the evidence doesn't just point to poor service. It points to deliberate misrepresentation." Helen nodded slowly. "That's a fair interpretation." Naomi finally spoke, her tone calm but sharp enough to cut through the air. "What matters now is how your airline chooses to respond. Because this isn't about one man. It's about the culture that allowed him to believe he could behave this way without consequence." Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed her lips together, then said, "I want you to meet with our CEO. Daniel Warren will want to hear this directly." 2 days later, Naomi found herself walking into the executive floor of the airline's Miami Tower. The space was modern and sleek, walls lined with photographs of gleaming aircraft and framed awards for safety and service. Leonard walked beside her, his quiet presence grounding her. Daniel Warren greeted them in a corner office overlooking Biscayne Bay. He was tall, with graying hair and a crisp suit, the kind of man accustomed to authority. But his handshake was firm, not performative. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, gesturing toward the table. "I've read the reports. I wanted to hear from you personally." Naomi took her seat, unhurried. "Then I'll be clear. What I experienced was not an isolated moment of rudeness. It was part of a larger issue, an attitude that some passengers are more deserving of dignity than others. If it happened to me, it's happened to others. The difference is, I'm in a position to address it." Daniel studied her, his expression careful. "I don't deny that bias exists in the industry, but you're asking us to acknowledge it openly, which has consequences." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "Silence has consequences, too. The question is, which consequences you're willing to live with," Leonard interjected, his voice measured. "Naomi doesn't seek retribution. She seeks reform. You have an opportunity here not just to correct one incident, but to lead the industry forward." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering. What would reform look like to you? Naomi had already thought this through. First, transparency. Incidents like this can't disappear into hidden files. Second, training that addresses bias, not as a side note, but as a core competency. Third, a channel for passengers and crew alike to report misconduct without fear of dismissal. And finally, accountability, real consequences for actions, not symbolic gestures. The CEO was silent for a long moment. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Then he nodded. "I can't promise overnight change, but I hear you, and I believe we can build something better if we're willing to confront the uncomfortable." Naomi's voice softened slightly. Uncomfortable truths are the only ones worth confronting. The meeting ended with a sense of unfinished business, but also possibility. As Naomi and Leonard walked back into the Miami heat, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. It would not be easy. Resistance would come, as it always did when power structures were questioned. But the seed had been planted. Later that evening, Naomi sat by the hotel window, watching the city lights flicker against the water. Leonard poured her a glass of sparkling water and set it gently on the table. "You know this could turn into a battle," he said quietly. Naomi traced the rim of the glass with her finger. "It already has. The question is whether they're prepared to fight for change or against it." Her phone buzzed. A new message from Julia Nguyen lit the screen. "I've thought a lot about what happened. If you need me to testify or speak publicly, I will. It's not right what he did. People need to know." Naomi smiled faintly, her chest warming. Courage was contagious. She typed back, "Thank you, Julia. Your voice matters more than you know." The investigation was still unfolding, but Naomi sensed the shift already beginning. Witnesses were stepping forward. Executives were listening. The truth, once buried beneath silence, was finding its way into the open. And Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Naomi hadn't planned for it, not yet. But stories have a way of slipping into the world when people whisper long enough. A local Miami paper published an article titled, "Passenger Claims Bias on Flight to Miami." It didn't mention Naomi by name, but the details were unmistakable. The route, the date, the accusations of dismissive treatment. By noon, the article had spread across national outlets, each adding its own angle. Words like discrimination, bias, and dignity flooded the headlines. Naomi sat at the dining table in the hotel suite, scrolling through her phone. Notifications buzzed faster than she could silence them. Some messages came from friends offering support. Others came from reporters asking for comment. The weight of public attention pressed hard, but she felt calm, anchored by the clarity of truth. Leonard walked in, a folded newspaper under his arm. "It's out," he said simply. Setting it on the table, Naomi nodded. It was bound to be. By late afternoon, cameras gathered outside the hotel. Microphones stretched forward as Naomi and Leonard walked out, flanked by hotel security. Voices called her name, questions overlapping Mrs. Ellis. "Do you plan to sue? Do you believe this is systemic? Will you name the airline?" Naomi stopped, turning toward the crowd. She didn't raise her voice, but the firmness in her tone cut through the chaos. "I don't need to raise names," she said evenly. "The truth speaks for itself. This is bigger than one flight, one attendant, or one passenger. It's about the dignity every traveler deserves. What happened to me has happened to others. Too many times. Silence was the only witness. Not this time." The cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled frantically. Naomi offered no further words, simply nodding once before walking with Leonard toward the waiting car. By evening, the video of her statement had gone viral. Hashtags multiplied across social media. "For dignity in the air." "Flying while black." "Naomi Ellis." Strangers shared their own stories of bias on flights, stories that echoed her own in painful ways. That night, Julia Nguyen called. Her voice trembled slightly, but determination underpinned every word. "Naomi, the news is everywhere. I've had parents from my school reach out, saying they saw me in the article. They asked if it was true. I told them yes, and I told them I'd stand with you." Naomi's heart softened. "You don't have to put yourself in the spotlight." "Julia." "I do," Julia insisted. "My students need to know that silence isn't the only option. If I stay quiet, what does that teach them?" Naomi closed her eyes, moved by the courage in the teacher's voice. "Then we'll face this together." The next day, Naomi was invited to appear on a morning news show. She agreed reluctantly, knowing her words would shape the narrative. Sitting beneath the bright studio lights, she wore the same calm expression she had held in the cabin days earlier. The interviewer leaned forward, Mrs. Ellis. Some people argue this was just a misunderstanding, that perhaps the flight attendant was stressed or overworked. How do you respond? Naomi's voice was measured, deliberate. Stress doesn't excuse bias. Fatigue doesn't justify disrespect. We all carry burdens, but when those burdens are used to diminish another person's humanity, that's not circumstance, it's choice. The interviewer nodded slowly, visibly struck. Within hours, clips from the segment spread online, accumulating millions of views. Naomi's calm defiance resonated deeply. Comments flooded in. She spoke the truth without anger. This is the kind of leadership we need. Behind closed doors, the airline scrambled. Emails flew between executives. PR advisors debated responses. Daniel Warren called Helen Brooks into his office. "This is no longer an internal matter," he said grimly. "We're facing a reputational crisis. We need to decide, do we acknowledge openly, or do we try to contain it?" Helen met his gaze firmly. "Containment won't work. The story is already bigger than us. Mrs. Ellis doesn't want revenge. She wants reform. If we fight her, we lose. If we listen, we lead." Daniel exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Then we call her in. And this time, we don't just hear her, we act." That evening, Naomi received the call. The CEO wanted to meet again, this time with senior leadership present. Leonard looked at her across the suite. "They're feeling the pressure." Naomi sipped her tea, her eyes steady. "Good. Pressure shapes change." 2 days later, Naomi entered a boardroom lined with executives, their faces tense but attentive. Cameras were absent. This was closed door, but the weight of public scrutiny pressed invisibly against every wall. Daniel Warren spoke first. "Mrs. Ellis, the events of your flight have sparked a national conversation. We recognize the gravity. We want to discuss how we move forward not just with you, but with our company." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding yet calm. "Then let's be clear. Moving forward means acknowledging the truth, not softening it. It means change that reaches every gate, every cabin, every passenger. Anything less is cosmetic." A murmur swept through the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably, but Daniel raised a hand to silence the whispers. His eyes stayed on Naomi. "You're asking us to dismantle habits that have gone unchecked for decades." Naomi held his gaze. "I'm asking you to choose dignity over convenience. If you claim to serve the public, then serve all of them, without condition, without prejudice." The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. Then, slowly, Daniel nodded. "We'll draft a public statement tonight, and we'll back it with action, for the first time since the ordeal began." Naomi felt the faint stirrings of something larger than confrontation. It was possibility, fragile, uncertain, but real. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Naomi sat at the center of the long table, her back straight, her hands folded loosely. Daniel Warren sat opposite her, his expression composed but weighted by the knowledge that the company's next steps would define more than its reputation, they would define its future. An assistant distributed copies of a draft statement. Naomi scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing at the words, "We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred." She looked up. "This won't work." One of the executives, a man in a striped tie, frowned. "Mrs. Ellis, public statements must be carefully worded. We can't expose ourselves to unnecessary liability." Naomi's voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet authority that silenced the room. "You can't fix what you won't name." Calling this a misunderstanding erases the truth. This wasn't a slip of service. It was a moment of bias. Pretending otherwise only deepens the wound. Helen Brooks shifted in her seat, nodding slightly in agreement. Daniel noticed, his jaw tightening. "Then how do we phrase it?" he asked. Naomi leaned forward. "Start with honesty. Say you recognize that bias exists. Say you're committed to eradicating it in your airline. Say that dignity isn't negotiable for any passenger, no matter what they look like or how they're dressed. Then show what you're doing about it." The room went quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Helen broke the silence. "She's right. Anything less will feel hollow." The man in the striped tie looked unconvinced, but Daniel raised a hand. "Enough. We'll adjust the statement." He turned back to Naomi. "What actions would you expect us to announce Naomi was ready?" She outlined it clearly. 1. Mandatory bias and dignity training for all staff. Not a 1-hour online module, but real workshops with accountability. 2. Passenger advocate positions at every hub, people trained to intervene when issues arise, so dignity isn't left to chance. 3. Transparent reporting channels where passengers and crew could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. 4. Regular audits of complaints and outcomes, with public summaries. "This isn't just about restoring trust," Naomi said softly. "It's about earning it." Leonard, quiet until now, added, "And if you lead, other airlines will follow. But if you hide, the public will remember." Daniel's gaze moved from Naomi to Leonard, then back again. He exhaled slowly. "You've left us little choice. We either evolve, or we become the example of what happens when you refuse to." For the next hour, the boardroom became a workshop of sorts. Words were reworked, plans debated, timelines drawn. Naomi contributed when necessary, her input shaping the bones of reform. She didn't dominate, she guided. By the end, the statement read very differently. "We acknowledge that bias can exist anywhere, even in our cabins. This week, we failed to uphold the dignity every passenger deserves. We are committed to change, effective immediately. We will implement mandatory training, establish passenger advocates in every hub, and create transparent reporting channels to ensure accountability. Dignity is not optional. It is our standard." Naomi read it slowly, then gave a small nod. "This is a beginning. Don't let it end here." Daniel looked at her across the table, something like respect softening his eyes. "You've pushed us into uncomfortable territory, Mrs. Ellis, but perhaps discomfort is the only path forward." When the meeting adjourned, Naomi and Leonard stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, Leonard turned to her. That was more than a meeting. That was a pivot. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. A turning point. Yes. But pivots only matter if you keep walking in the new direction. Outside, the humid Miami air wrapped around them. Reporters lingered near the entrance, cameras poised. Daniel had agreed the statement would be released within 24 hours. Naomi didn't need to say more now. The airline's actions would speak louder. That evening, Naomi and Leonard returned to their hotel suite. She sank into a chair by the window, exhausted but steady. Leonard poured her a glass of water and set it on the table. "You carried that room," he said softly. Naomi gazed out at the city lights. "I didn't carry it. I held up a mirror. They just didn't like what they saw." Her phone buzzed. A message from Julia Nguyen glowed on the screen. Saw the update. "Proud to stand with you. If you need me to speak publicly, I'm ready." Naomi's heart warmed. Courage catches like fire, she thought. One person's stand gave others permission to rise. She typed back, "Thank you, Julia." There may come a time when your voice is needed. For now, just keep being who you are. That's already enough." She set the phone aside and leaned back, letting the city's glow wash over her. The turning point had come. The question now was whether the momentum would carry. Naomi knew the answer rested not in boardrooms or press releases, but in the countless small moments on flights every day, moments where dignity would either be upheld or denied. She closed her eyes, her voice a whisper Leonard could barely hear. The work begins now. The next morning, the airline statement went live. News outlets blasted the headline, "Airline acknowledges bias, promises industry-leading reform." The words were bold, and for once, they weren't wrapped in excuses. Naomi sat in the hotel lounge with Leonard, the screen of her phone glowing with constant updates. Comments poured in, some praising the airline for its honesty, others skeptical it would last. But the common thread was undeniable. People were talking. A message arrived from Helen Brooks. "Mrs. Ellis, the CEO would like you to address the press with us this afternoon. He believes your voice will give the message credibility." Naomi looked at Leonard, who arched an eyebrow. "You don't have to do this," he reminded her. "I know," Naomi said quietly, setting her phone down. "But I want to. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about every passenger who never got heard." That afternoon, Naomi stood at a podium beside Daniel Warren and Helen Brooks. Cameras lined the room, microphones clustered like eager ears. Daniel spoke first, his tone steady but humble. "In recent days, our airline has faced hard truths. A passenger's experience revealed bias within our service. We failed her, and in doing so, we failed our values. Today, we commit to change, real, lasting change. We will not hide behind excuses. We will not dismiss the reality of bias. We will face it and dismantle it." He gestured toward Naomi. "Mrs. Ellis has graciously agreed to speak. Her courage brought us here, and her words will remind us why this work matters." Naomi stepped forward. The cameras flashed, but her voice was calm, her cadence deliberate. "I didn't ask to be the center of this story. I was just a passenger on a flight. But the way I was treated wasn't about one seat or one journey. It was about dignity. And dignity, once denied, demands a response. This isn't about punishing one employee. It's about changing a culture. Every traveler, whether they wear a designer suit or a sweater worn at the elbows, deserves respect. I stand here today not to seek revenge, but to insist on reform. The airline has made promises. Now it's up to all of us leaders, staff, and passengers to ensure those promises become practice." The room went silent for a moment after she spoke. Then applause rose, not thunderous, but steady, like an acknowledgement of truth too long ignored. That night, videos of Naomi's speech circled the internet. Strangers tagged her name with messages of gratitude. "She spoke for me." Finally, someone said it plainly. Dignity isn't optional. Julian Nguyen sent another message. "My students saw your speech. They said, 'That's Ms. Nguyen's friend.' They're asking questions about dignity now. You've started something in my classroom." Naomi smiled, her chest warming. She typed back, "They'll carry that with them. That's how change grows seed by seed." In the days that followed, Naomi's life returned to its rhythms, but the echoes of the moment remained. The airline began rolling out training modules, real workshops that employees described as challenging but eye-opening. Passenger advocate positions were posted at major hubs. A new reporting portal went live, promising transparency. Mark Duffy's name appeared once more in Naomi's inbox. not in anger, but in a letter delivered through Helen Brooks. It was brief, handwritten, unpolished. Mrs. Ellis, I know you may not care to hear from me, but I need to say this. I was wrong. I treated you with disrespect I never should have shown. Your calmness only highlighted my failure. I've been given the chance to undergo training and mentoring instead of termination. I intend to take it seriously. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I am listening now. Mark Duffy. Naomi read the note twice. She set it down on the table, exhaling slowly. Leonard watched her. What do you think? I think remorse doesn't erase harm, Naomi said softly. But reflection can prevent future harm. If he truly learns, then it's worth more than his firing ever would have been. Leonard nodded. That's your gift. You don't just want justice for yourself. You want change for everyone. Weeks later, Naomi boarded another flight, this time to Chicago. As she stepped into the cabin, a passenger advocate greeted her warmly, ensuring she knew where to turn if any issues arose. Naomi smiled, feeling the ripple of progress in the smallest of gestures. She took her seat, opened her tote, and breathed deeply. The hum of the engine sounded different now, not just machinery, but momentum. She thought back to the moment in Boston, when she had simply wanted peace. She didn't find it then. But now, as she looked out the window at the clouds beginning to part, she realized she had found something better. She had found purpose. Months passed, and the world seemed to move on as it always does. Headlines shifted to new crises, new scandals, new voices demanding attention. But for Naomi Ellis, the story didn't fade. It evolved. She sat one morning in her home office, sunlight spilling through tall windows, papers spread across her desk. On the wall hung a framed clipping, "Dignity is not optional." It was the headline from the day after her speech, printed in bold black letters. She hadn't framed it out of pride, but as a reminder. The airline reforms she had pushed for were underway. Reports showed that passenger complaints had dropped, not just in number, but in severity. Employees described the new training as hard, but necessary. Passenger advocates had already intervened in several situations, resolving conflicts before they escalated. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But progress was visible, measurable. Leonard walked into the room with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one gently beside her. "You've been at it since dawn again," he teased softly. Naomi smiled, lifting the mug. "Old habits. You've turned a single flight into a movement," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not many people could have done that." Naomi shook her head. "I didn't create the movement. I just gave voice to what was already there, waiting. People were ready to be heard. They just needed someone to break the silence." A knock at the door interrupted them. Julia Nguyen stood there, holding a folder. Her face carried both nervousness and pride. "Julia!" Naomi greeted warmly, rising to hug her. "What brings you here?" Julia held out the folder. "My students put this together. It's their reflections after we talked about your story. They wanted you to have it." Naomi opened the folder carefully. Inside were handwritten essays, drawings, even poems. One child had drawn a picture of an airplane with the words, "Everyone deserves a seat." Another had written, "Ms. Nguyen told us about dignity. I think dignity means treating people like they matter." Naomi felt her throat tighten. She closed the folder gently, her eyes moist. "This," she whispered, "is the legacy." Julia smiled shyly. "You should know you've inspired more than just policy. You've inspired classrooms." That evening, Naomi sat by the fire with Leonard, the folder on her lap. She read each page slowly, savoring the voices of children who would one day carry the torch further than she could. Leonard leaned back, watching her. "So what's next?" Naomi looked up, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Next is making sure this doesn't stop at one airline. Dignity doesn't belong to one company. It belongs to everyone." She wasn't finished. She knew that. There would be conferences to attend, panels to speak on, initiatives to guide. But she also knew that the true measure of her work wasn't in speeches or headlines. It was in moments, the quiet choices of strangers who now understood dignity a little better. Weeks later, Naomi boarded another flight, this time heading to Washington, D.C., to speak before a congressional committee on passenger rights. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Mrs. Ellis, we're honored to have you on board today. If there's anything you need, please let me know." Naomi thanked her, but what struck her most wasn't the attention. It was the tone. Sincere, respectful, unforced. She looked out the window as the plane lifted into the sky. Clouds parted, and sunlight spilled across the horizon. Her journey had begun in humiliation, sparked by judgment over a sweater and worn sneakers. It had grown into a reckoning that reached boardrooms, classrooms, and even the halls of Congress. And now, as the plane carried her higher, she felt the truth settle in her bones. Dignity wasn't a gift to be granted. It was a birthright to be honored. Naomi closed her eyes, the hum of the engine steady in her ears. She thought of Julia's students, of Mark Duffy's letter, of the countless passengers who would never know her name, but would feel the ripple of her stand. The story wasn't about a Rolls-Royce or a headline anymore. It was about the quiet power of refusing to shrink, the courage to hold a seat not just for oneself, but for everyone. And that, Naomi knew, would be her lasting legacy. The story of Naomi Ellis reminds us that dignity is not measured by clothes, status, or wealth. It is a birthright. Too often, we judge people by what we see on the surface, forgetting that behind every worn sweater or tired face is a life filled with struggles, triumphs, and unspoken strength. For older generations, this lesson echoes with even deeper truth. Many of us know what it feels like to be underestimated, ignored, or dismissed. Naomi's response teaches us that power doesn't always come from anger or revenge. True power lies in grace, the ability to stand firm without losing compassion, to demand respect without raising your voice. She chose to transform humiliation into change, not only for herself, but for others who might face the same prejudice tomorrow. In our daily lives, the choice is always before us. Do we see people as labels, or do we honor them as human beings? The way we answer that question, whether at a grocery store, on a bus, or in our own family, shapes the kind of society we leave behind. Dignity given is dignity received, and that, perhaps, is the simplest but most profound lesson of all. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Naomi's story touched your heart, we invite you to keep the conversation alive. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and hope. Your support helps us bring these voices to life. See you in the next story.